The summons arrived at 600 station time, which was James Corvin's first indication that his carefully maintained, unremarkable existence was about to become complicated. The message was formal, encrypted, and utterly baffling. Your presence is requested for private audience with Queen Selith of the Inari delegation. Level 7 diplomatic suites, Chamber 12, 1400 hours. Attendance is expected. James read it 3 times before accepting that yes, they meant him, and no, there was no explanation attached. His supervisor, Martinez, seemed equally confused. You piss off the Inari somehow. Mistranslate something critical. Not that I know of. James pulled up his recent work, agricultural trade agreements, resource allocation documents, the kind of tedious but essential material that kept civilizations from accidentally starting wars over grain quotas. Nothing involving Inari royal protocols. Well, you don't decline a royal summons. Martinez clapped his shoulder with slightly more force than necessary. Try not to cause an interstellar incident. But James spent the hours before the meeting researching Inari customs, the 17 forms of respectful address, the significance of ear positions, the elaborate dance of formal greetings that could apparently communicate entire political positions through posture alone. The Inari were reserved, hierarchical, and intensely formal. Their queen rarely granted private audiences to anyone outside senior diplomatic staff. The meeting chamber was smaller than he'd expected, decorated in flowing organic style, bioluminescent panels, furniture that looked grown rather than manufactured. Queen Selith stood by the observation window, silhouetted against stars. She turned when he entered. James executed what he desperately hoped was the correct bow. Selith was younger than the official images suggested, her features carrying that ageless quality common to her species. Her elongated ears angled forward slightly. Curiosity, maybe, and her formal robes fell in precisely arranged folds that probably communicated her exact rank and lineage to anyone who understood the coding. She studied him in silence. James resisted the urge to fidget. "You are the one who corrected Ambassador Thren's translation error," Selith finally said, her English flawless. "3 weeks ago, the grain quality specifications." James blinked. That had been minor, barely worth mentioning. Thren had confused 2 similar words, and James had quietly noted the correction in the margins. "Yes, Your Majesty. It was a small mistake, easily made. I hope I didn't cause offense by. You prevented a significant misunderstanding that would have cost both our peoples considerable resources." Her amber eyes held his. "And you did so with discretion that preserved the ambassador's dignity." James had no idea what to say to that. Selith moved closer, her movements precise and controlled. "I wish to thank you personally, and to understand something about how humans approach translation." The formal gratitude James had expected dissolved into something stranger. Queen Selith asking about translation theory, about the philosophy of meaning and interpretation, about the small details of his work that most people found terminally boring. She listened with an intensity that made him self-conscious, her ears tracking subtle shifts in his tone that he hadn't known he was making. "You prioritize intent over literal accuracy," Selith observed after he'd explained his approach to idiomatic expressions. "Even when literal translation is possible, context matters more than precision sometimes. A perfectly accurate translation that misses the speaker's meaning isn't actually accurate at all. My tutors would disagree. They believe precision is the foundation of understanding. Respectfully, Your Majesty, your tutors probably haven't tried explaining human sarcasm to someone who doesn't have the cultural framework for it." Selith's ears angled in what he was learning to recognize as amusement. "You disagree with my tutors," boldly. "I disagree with their specific position on translation philosophy," James corrected. "I'm sure they're excellent tutors otherwise. They are tedious and rigid." Selith moved to examine his datapad where he'd pulled up examples, but effective at maintaining traditional approaches. An hour passed then too. The rigid formality gradually softened into something approaching actual dialogue. Selith had opinions about metaphor that were surprisingly passionate, and when James pushed back on her assertion that literal translation was always preferable, she engaged the argument with sharp intelligence rather than royal dismissal. She mentioned, almost casually, the isolation of her position, representing her people while never quite being allowed to be simply herself. James, emboldened by her candor, admitted he'd chosen translation work specifically because it let him be useful while remaining invisible. Invisibility as strategy, Seleth said thoughtfully. I understand this. Though it seems wasteful, your skills deserve visibility. Visibility brings expectations I'm not equipped to meet, Your Majesty. Seleth, the correction was quiet. Here now you may use my name. The informality shocked him more than the summons had. Inari royalty didn't offer personal names casually. Before James could process the implications, Seleth moved closer to examine a translation file on his datapad. Close enough that he could see the subtle bioluminescent patterns in her skin, catch a scent like rain and growing things. Close enough that every formal boundary her culture maintained had collapsed entirely. She was reading over his shoulder, seemingly unaware of how thoroughly she'd violated the spatial protocols he'd spent hours memorizing. James stood very still, afraid that acknowledging the proximity would shatter whatever strange trust had formed. Seleth was explaining an Inari grammatical nuance, her finger tracing text on his datapad, when she stumbled slightly. Exhaustion, maybe, or formal robes not designed for casual movement. James's hand moved before his brain engaged, reaching out to steady her. His fingers closed gently around hers. Everything stopped. Seleth froze completely, her amber eyes wide, the bioluminescent patterns in her skin brightening with what looked like a full-body blush. Her ears flattened back against her head, acute embarrassment, his research whispered. He just touched the queen, without permission, with casual familiarity that probably violated treaties. I'm sorry, James started, beginning to pull back. Seleth's hand tightened on his, not releasing, not pulling away, holding on. They stood frozen, both clearly aware they'd crossed some boundary neither had intended to approach. I should not have. Seleth's voice was barely audible. The proximity was inappropriate. I forgot myself. You stumbled, I reacted. That's on me, your Seleth. Her fingers were still intertwined with his, warm and slightly trembling. The bioluminescence in her skin pulsed in patterns he couldn't interpret but recognized as emotional. In my culture, Seleth said carefully, not looking at him, physical contact outside family or formal ceremony is significant. It implies trust, intimacy, things not given lightly. I didn't know, I'm sorry. You should not apologize for kindness. She finally met his eyes, and the vulnerability there struck him harder than any diplomatic rebuke could have. I am not accustomed to gestures made without calculation. You reached for me because I needed steadying, not because protocol demanded it or advantage suggested it. James understood then. She'd spent her entire life in contexts where every touch, every gesture, every word carried political weight. An unthinking act of casual support was foreign enough to completely break her composure. I'm just a translator, he said quietly. I don't know the games you're expected to play. I saw someone stumbling and I reacted. That's all. That is not all. Seleth's grip on his hand shifted, becoming less frozen surprise and more deliberate choice. That is everything. The bioluminescent patterns in her skin gradually steadied, shifting from the chaos of embarrassment to something warmer, more intentional. Neither of them moved to restore the proper distance. The meeting stretched far beyond its scheduled duration. When Seleth finally, reluctantly released his hand, the formal distance didn't fully return. They stood closer than protocol allowed, talking in voices not quite meant for official record, sharing observations about diplomatic theater, and the loneliness of representing entire civilizations while never being permitted personal connection. My advisors will be horrified, Seleth said, something almost like humor in her tone. A private audience extending this long, with physical contact, with a human they'll certainly perceive as politically insignificant. The scandal will be remarkable. I can claim I bored you with linguistics theory, James offered. No. Seleth's amber eyes held his with unexpected intensity. I will not diminish this. You treated me as person, not position. You showed me kindness without agenda. Those are not things I will apologize for valuing. She stepped closer again, deliberately this time. She took his hand properly, with both of hers, in what his research identified as an Inari gesture of profound personal trust. I would like to continue this, she said. These conversations, if you are willing to endure the political complications my attention will certainly create for you. James thought about his carefully maintained invisibility, his strategic unremarkability, the quiet life he'd built in the margins of galactic diplomacy. He thought about Seleth's hand in his, the vulnerability she'd shown, the sharp intelligence beneath the formal exterior. I'm willing, he said. Seleth's bioluminescent patterns brightened pleasure he'd learned or maybe relief. Then I will arrange it, discreetly to the extent possible, though I warn you, discretion is not among my people's stronger capabilities. I'm a translator. I'm good at reading between the lines. Good. She released his hand with visible reluctance. Because what I am suggesting exists entirely in the spaces between official policy and personal truth. The meeting ended with formal protocols reasserted, proper bows exchanged, diplomatic language carefully deployed. But as James left the chamber, he carried the warmth of that contact, the memory of a queen who'd frozen in embarrassment at a simple gesture, and then chosen to hold on rather than retreat behind authority. His datapad chimed before he'd reached the corridor's end. A meeting request for the